Good afternoon and welcome to the Yale Center for British Art's opening of the exhibition Art in Focus, Women from the Center. I'm Linda Friedlander, Head of Education. These exhibitions are an annual event to provide Yale undergraduates the experience of putting together an exhibition relating to the center's holdings. Students are guided through the process by members of a number of our departments, and we thank them for their involvement. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for the group, and they will be answered at the end of the program. Before turning it over to the students' presentations, we would like to honor the work of Rena Banerjee. Rena represents that group of graduate students who have been admitted to Yale since the 1880s, unlike undergraduates who didn't enter Yale until 1970. Rena Banerjee is represented by this painting that you see in front of you, and it's titled Upon First Myth and Empirical Observation, the Hero, Her Angel Leaps and Cry, opens the moon to urge on a rain that may cleanse all the sweat of her jealous man. Thank you, Rena, for being a part of this very special exhibition and for helping us open up the exhibition to members of the public. Now I'd like to introduce Annie Roberts, who is one of the student guides and a member of the class of 2022.
Hi, thank you, Linda. So my name is Annie Roberts. I'm a current senior in Yale College, double majoring in art history and African American studies. As Linda pointed out, I am one of the student guides here at the center, as well as one of the 5 student curators of women from the center. Before we begin, I wanted to give a special thank you to Linda Friedlander, Head of Education, Jennifer Reynolds Kay, former educator, and Rachel Stratton, former postdoctoral research associate, for your help and advice throughout the creation of this show. I also wanted to thank Director Martin and the center for taking the time to work with us and give us advice as we developed Women from the Center and moved it to a digital format. And so before the rest of my fellow curators dive into the specifics of the show and talk us through a few of the works included, I wanted to give a little bit of background as to how we developed the show. So in the spring of 2019, the 5 student curators who worked on this show were chosen from the center's student guide program group to curate the upcoming or the current Art in Focus show. Art in Focus is an annual initiative of the center's student guide program, and each year the student curators are given a very broad topic from which they develop a show. Inspired by Yale University's celebration of 50 years of coeducation in Yale College and 150 years of coeducation in Yale graduate programs, and specifically starting with the art program, which is really cool, I think, we were given the topic of women. Throughout the following summer and fall, we worked with the center staff to comb through almost all of the women artists represented in the center, slowly whittling down hundreds to about 30. It was incredibly important to all of us that we highlight the breadth of women's art while also resisting the impulse to make any claims about an essential femaleness, which may or may not be found within the works. From our final group of about 30, we developed 4 themes, cutting down our selection to the 14 works which you will see today. Those final themes, which you will hear more about over the course of this program, are women in institutions, space and place, women as muses, and beyond the figure. Finally, we divided the writing of the text for the walls and brochure amongst the 5 of us and worked to finalize the exhibition hang and the kind of visual format of the show. Together, the works we chose highlight women artists, some of whom are household names and some of whom are kind of hidden gems in the center's collection, whose innovative art practices have enabled them to stake out place in the art world. Before I turn it over to Olivia, I want to touch on the title of the exhibit, Women from the Center references both the use of the collection of the Yale Center for British Art and Lucy Lepard's influential collection of feminist essays, From the Center, which was first published in 1976. In it, she states that the women's movement changed my life in many ways, not the least being my approach to criticism. From the inside, from where I live, there is a new freedom to say how I feel and to respond to all art on a far more personal level. Lepard continues in her essays, saying that the examination of women's art led her to the realization that I still have to question every assumption, every reaction I have, in order to examine them for signs of preconditioning. Nearly 45 years later, we are still discovering new frames from which to appreciate the work of women artists, and, like Lepard, being asked to examine ourselves for the preconditioning and assumptions that we all hold. The artists on display in this exhibit span the 19th century to the present day and work across a broad spectrum of media, style, and technique. This exhibition has been a very long time coming, and it's just been such an amazing way to extend what we've all learned through the Guides program, which many of us have been a part of for a number of years. I'm so excited that we're able to talk about women from the center with you today. And now to Olivia, who will be presenting on the first theme of the exhibit.
Hi, I'm Olivia Thomas. I graduated from Yale in May with the class of 2020. I was in Morse College and I studied art history and economics. And today I'll be introducing the theme of women and institutions. So you can see the three works we've chosen. And when grouping these works together, the first thing we considered is what is an institution? So for our purposes, we defined an institution as an arbiter of knowledge that has sought to dictate a woman's role in society. Next, we thought about how do these works all address different institutions? With these works in particular, we thought about the institutions of literature, the museum, and science. So first, let's take a closer look at the image on the left and think about how might literature dictate a woman's role in society. This lithograph is by Paula Rego, and it's entitled Jane Eyre. It's part of a series called The Guardians, which she made between 2001 and 2002. Rego is a British-Portuguese artist who was born in 1935. So Jane Eyre, as a character in Charlotte Bronte's novel, is an impoverished orphan who develops a relationship with her wealthy employer. So in this sense, the protagonist was an agent for social change. However, in art, Jane was often depicted as plain and demure and in a position of domestic servitude. So in this sense, we're already getting to see how literature and the arts can kind of dictate a woman's role in society. So looking at the image on the right and thinking about how it addresses an institution, the image on the right is a piece called Eryngium Fetidum Prue. It was created in 2009 by Jocelyn Gardner as part of a series called Creole Portraits 3, Bringing Down the Flowers. So Gardner was drawing on a family history in Barbados that dates from the 17th century, and she probed colonial material culture that was found in British and Caribbean archives. So each work in the series is a hand-colored lithograph that is named after a botanical specimen using a binomial system of nomenclature. So in this case, Eryngium Fetidum, and then paired with an enslaved person's plantation name, which in this case was Prue. So when I first saw this image, I really didn't know what to make of it. But what we're actually looking at is the back of a woman's head. So Gardner is presenting us with a faceless female figure. And the anonymous enslaved woman is presented with an instrument of torture around her neck. And if you take a closer look at this device, you can see this instrument of torture that has these three sharp spikes protruding from either side of her neck. So this horrific image of the torture tool, which is paired with the scientific presentation of the plant in the image and in the title, directly addresses the institution of Western science and its problematic system of categorization, which justified human hierarchies based on race. So we'll return to both these in a moment, but I want to introduce the last piece, which is right in the center. This piece is called When and Where I Enter the British Museum by Carrie Mae Weems. You can see in this image, the subject, who is actually Carrie Mae Weems herself, directly and literally confronts the institution of the British Museum. The British Museum in London represents the operations of an empire. It contains artifacts that were sourced and often stolen from countries across the globe. So in this sense, this institution is creating a narrative of British history, who belongs and who doesn't belong. And Weems ponders, does an African-American woman belong in this history, in this institution? So we've addressed how all these images confront different institutions that have created the rules of society. But how do these works also transform the figures of the woman into symbols of autonomy and empowerment? I want you to take a moment, just think about what is similar among these three pieces. Well, for one of the striking similarities among the three is they're all presenting a woman with her back turned towards the viewer. This is very different than some of the norms of portraiture, which present women in order to celebrate their feminine beauty or create a spectacle for the male gaze. And gaze is something some of the other guides will talk about as well. In the images to the left and the center, you can see strength in the stance of Jane Eyre and in Carrie Mae Weems. They're wearing simple clothes, all black, and they're kind of undecorated in a sense. So Jane Eyre on the left, rather than plain and demure, she's depicted as powerful and upright. So Rago's celebrating an author who challenged the prevailing representation of women, and she's celebrating a female protagonist who literally is turning her back on the prevailing representation of women. And then on the right, we see Jocelyn's Gardner piece. So we have this horrible instrument of torture around this enslaved woman's neck. So how could Gardner possibly be empowering the figure? Well, for one, the elaborate hairstyle recalls one way in which enslaved women were able to celebrate their cultural identities and reclaim agency. Second, the botanical specimen that we see, Eryngium fetidum, was used by enslaved women to induce abortion and resist the co-option of their bodies to perpetuate slavery. So in this sense, this botanical specimen represents one way in which women might take control of their own bodies. And then in the center, we've got Weems in this self-portrait. She has this defiant stance in front of the British Museum. She's hesitant to enter, questioning whether her identity as an African-American woman can be reconciled with this institution. So let's take a closer look at this piece by Carrie Mae Weems. Next slide. So first, we see the British Museum. Literally, she's confronting the operations of an empire, and the impact and the magnitude of this empire is represented by this large building with its weighty columns. But Carrie Mae Weems, she wears all black, and she stands in stark contrast not only to the museum, but also to this flock of tourists who seem to enter the museum without hesitation. She's almost halted in front of the stairs like a soldier, kind of mirroring those weighty columns that we see in front of the British Museum. And those horizontal steps visually are almost like a dividing line between her and the museum. Carrie Mae Weems has said, quote, "My work endlessly explodes the limits of tradition." So Weems herself is saying that her works challenge the bodies of knowledge, these established canons that shape our identities. But not only is Weems using her own body, standing in front of the British Museum to challenge an institution, but she also is calling on the audience, making the audience ponder, what institutions do you feel like you're welcome in? Do you feel like you're a part of? And her work strikes conversations that challenge institutions, like museums, that might be inextricably linked with fraught histories. And I'll end by speaking about the title of the work, When and Where I Enter the British Museum. It seems that with this title, Weems is reclaiming her autonomy in a sense. She's deciding when she enters, where she enters, and if she enters the British Museum, considering her own place within the established canon, rather than letting an institution decide it for her. So to conclude, the three different works I talked about, what could literature, science, and museums all possibly have in common? Well, we can see three different artists using similar tactics, similar visual tactics to subvert the traditional norms of portraiture. And in subverting these traditional norms of portraiture, what female artists are transforming women into a symbol of autonomy. And in that way, they're also subverting the very institutions that are addressed in these different works. So now I'd like to introduce Christina, who will be talking about space and place.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I'm a junior history major at Yale College. And today I'm going to present on the space and place wall. So essentially this wall is a celebration of the agency of female artists to reimagine or unsettle different spaces and places. The pieces range from 1854 to 1998. They span industrial cityscapes and picturesque gardens. But what's at the core of all of these pieces is the disruption of traditionally masculine spaces or concepts. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the wall before talking more in depth about two particular pieces. The first on the far left is Prunella Clough's Midland Landscape, 1958, and that's one of the pieces I'll dive into deeper in a few moments. Moving towards the right is Cornelia Parker's Meteorite Lands on Woodworm Scrubs, and it's part of a series in which Parker actually heated up a fragment of meteorite and scorched through tourist maps of London. So imagine this hot piece of metal burning through sheet upon sheet of paper. And that's exactly what Parker did. And she did so on top of really controversial locations on the map, like Woodworm Scrubs, which is the one on the wall. And it was notorious for a really cruel and violent history. Moving further again to the right is Gillian Waring's The Garden, which is the other piece I'm going to talk more in depth about. So just to finish off this wall, on the far right is Anna Blunden's For Only One Short Hour. And the piece depicts the inequality and exploitation of the Industrial Revolution, but it does so from a really unique perspective. It takes us into an intimate domestic space, which is something that's not really seen depicting the Industrial Revolution from the 19th century. If we could go to the next slide, please. So now let's go more in depth with two of the pieces, starting with Midland Landscape. So first, a little background on Prunella Clough. She was a 20th century artist who preferred urban and industrial scenes. In a 1982 interview with Brian Robertson, she said, and I quote, "I prefer to be on my feet because the sense of place is crucial for me. Since I do not draw directly, it is the memory or recollections of a scene that concerns me," end quote. So she's portraying the emotionality of a place instead of its exact likeness. And that's what creates this Dickensian mist you see on the left of your screen, as Brian Robertson called it. So imagine if we were out in front of this industrial scene, we would see, very clear, stark, linear constructions, columns, walls, doors, windows, tangible objects. But by going based off of feelings and emotions, we lose that clarity and the place becomes grainy and murky. And this piece is even more murky in person because Clough used impasto, which is an art technique where you layer on material, you layer on paints and oils. So it creates a really textured and granular surface combined with the already fuzzy adaptation of the emotionality of the scene. So you're getting these very realistic earth tones, these blacks and tans and taupes, along with the grit that would normally accompany, like a masculine industrial space, at the same time as Clough reimagines it and makes it fuzzy and misty and fantastical and gives it this almost ethereal quality. And that juxtaposition is kind of spiritual, as Clough reimagines this masculine industrial space. And that spirituality is one of the minor themes of the wall. So remember the Blunden, in which the central figure is praying up to the smog-filled sky, or the scorched map by Parker. It's kind of reminiscent of the hand of God, a traditionally male and all-powerful figure, but in Parker's work, that wrath and destruction is coming from a female. And then you have the Waring that hints at the Garden of Eden, the fall of man and women's role in that, and the genderedness of the world's largest religion. And that brings me to the piece on the right. So again, I'm going to start with a little background on the artist. One of Waring's notable works is entitled, and this title is really long, so bear with me, Signs That Say What You Want Them to Say, and not signs that say what someone else wants you to say. So to create the piece, Waring went around with sheets of paper and a pen and asked people what they were thinking. And they wrote it down and held the piece of paper up in front of them, and Waring took a picture. So whatever it was that the person was thinking is at the forefront of the photograph, whether that's "I hate winter" or "I've been declared mildly insane." And that's just 2 out of a 100-piece series. And I bring up that other work because it does the same thing that The Garden does. It makes outward what will usually be locked inside. So let's talk a little bit about that. As you can see, there are 4 figures standing next to each other in the piece. The artist herself is second from the left, and she's joined by a cross-dresser, a prostitute, and an escort. They all wear long white t-shirts that go about to the upper thigh, and all of the shirts have different sayings on them. So one says, "I may not be brilliant, but I have great breasts. And another says, I'm shy, but I've got a big dick. Sorry, Dad. And these sayings are further intensified because they're the only color on an otherwise black and white screen print. So they're fully front and center, even before the aesthetic of the people wearing them. And everything is set against this backdrop of flowers and greenery. And lastly, it's also really important to note that the people in this screen print chose the shirts they're wearing. They chose these phrases that the viewer sees. So essentially what you have in this piece is, again, the inner becoming outer. And that's super important when you think about visual media and the possibility for exploitation. I mean, unless you are holding up a sign telling people what you're thinking, the superficial and the aesthetic is what's on view and what's being judged. But Waring rails against that, and she gives her subjects the voices they might not have had otherwise. And when asked about this piece, she said, and I quote, "We all start making up our minds when we see someone. We all get ideas based on how people look, even though we know these ideas can be knocked out of us as soon as we get close to them or start talking to them." And in this screen print with these t-shirts, Waring is starting that conversation. She's allowing the viewer to start talking to her subjects in some way. And the fact that this conversation is taking place in a garden, and the title of the piece is The Garden, there are these allusions to the Garden of Eden, which is really interesting when you think about the history and the connotations of that place. So the fall of humanity is the result of gaining knowledge that wasn't ours to gain. And a lot of that blame is put on Eve, the female in the garden. But Waring flips that because she gives us knowledge, kind of throws it in our face with these color elements, but it's not a sinful or a devious thing in her garden to obtain knowledge. In fact, it's necessary if we want to engage with the humanity of the people in the screen print, and the fact that women are the cause of that engagement of humanity and not its downfall. It's just another reason why Waring's garden is a little better in my opinion. But to conclude this presentation, every piece on this wall is the work of a female artist reimagining some space or some place in really thought-provoking and innovative ways. And that's what I wanted to celebrate. So with that, I will hand it off to Emma to talk about her Women as Muses wall.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, my name is Emma Gray, and I'm a senior in Saybrook, majoring in history. The theme that I was tasked to explore was women as muses. As you may have noticed while walking around almost any museum, the female muse is the most prevalent theme in Western art. Countless women have been objectified by the male gaze, brush, and camera over time. So we wanted to examine what happens when a woman is depicted not by a man who idealizes and sexualizes her, but by a female artist. The works you see, starting from the left, are Fanny Eaton by Joanna Boyce Wells, The Artist in Her Studio by Vanessa Bell, Sharon with Peonies by Nida Madahar, Auto Portraits by Joy Gregory, who we were lucky enough to hear from last week, and Irish Mary by Julia Margaret Cameron. In order to think about some of these ideas more concretely, I want to focus on one of the works on the wall, Nida Madahar's Sharon with Peonies, which was created in 2009. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. Madahar is an interdisciplinary artist who works primarily with photography. This work was part of her series entitled Flora, which was inspired by the 1935 Goddesses series by Madame Yvonde. The Goddesses series, on which Madahar based her work, depicted high society beauties, and you can see one of those on the bottom of the slide here. Madame Yvonde was known for pioneering the colored photographic portrait, and in this series she used her skillful photography to cast women as goddesses, and thus as ideal classical versions of femininity. In Madame Yvonde's series, the women derive their power through status and the men they marry. It's a work about wealth, hierarchy, and high society that applies traditional standards and norms to beauty. The women are photographed so that we can look at them and admire their elegance. By choosing lesser-known goddesses, Yvonde spoke specifically to the educated elite, who would have been the only ones familiar enough with mythology to recognize the characters. She assumed this would be her audience and limited who would understand the works. There were some parts of Yvonde's goddesses that Madahar embraced. In her artist statement, she wrote about how she was inspired by the camp and surreal qualities of the 1935 series, and how she liked that the portraits looked very constructed. She wrote of how she wanted Flora to feel stylized as a commentary on associations between fantasy and female beauty. There's a great deal of theatricality present in both series, and Madahar did retain some of the stylized femininity that's present in goddesses. But Madahar's take on goddesses departs from Yvonne's version in significant ways. Most notably, she rejects the conventional standards for goddesses, fashion models, and style icons. Instead of choosing all white, young, high society, sexualized women, Madahar photographs 17 of her 40 to 50-year-old female friends in strong and powerful poses. Instead of identifying the women by their last names, as Yvonne had, Madahar specifically leaves out the surnames of the women, replacing their last names with the names of the flowers they're accompanied by. Madahar wrote, "As a woman's surname is chiefly given either by her father or husband, I remove this patriarchal link by emphasizing only the first name." In a departure from conventional beauty standards, Madahar did not touch up these photographs. She used a non-digital process and did not affect how the women looked beyond makeup and lighting. She wanted to see, quote, "what regular, mature women look like and how skin, muscle, and fat appears." She worried about, quote, "the regular frequency with which articles about beauty, aging, and sexuality appear in the media." She also used a non-digital process and did not Photoshop her works because she saw this as a way of showing her relationship of photographic truth. In addition, it's important to note that because these women were her friends, Madahar felt a degree of trust and intimacy with them that allowed her to photograph their bodies while appreciating their lived experiences. She tried to explore her friendships in these photographs instead of just capturing the women's looks. Unlike Yvonne, Madahar even let her friends have a say in how they were shown. She let them pick out their flowers, suggest themes and tones, and demonstrate their personalities. In Sharon with Peonies, we see a 40-year-old woman named Sharon Lloyd with peonies in her hair against a silver background. Sharon looks nothing like the young white women of Yvonne's collection. She uses her stance and her clothes like armor to shield her body from our objectifying gaze. She has agency over her self-presentation. This feeling of power that Sharon portrays makes sense, given that she had a say in how she situated her body and that she felt comfortable in front of the camera as her friend took her photo. As Sharon looks out ahead of her, it's unclear what she's staring at. Perhaps she looks towards the future, signaling to us that although this is based on an old work, it's been updated in important ways and will continue to be revised as our understanding of the woman evolves. The flowers in Sharon's hair have a great deal of purpose within the larger work. Flowers are usually perceived as delicate, decorative, temporal, and something to be admired. In juxtaposition to the dainty peonies, Sharon is portrayed with sharp angles and is shown as strong and defiant. Unlike wilting flowers, these images will withstand the test of time. And the women's contemplative expressions show that they are not just meant to be decorative. They were not captured merely for the audience's enjoyment and gaze. Interestingly, Madahar's use of flowers in this work is entirely different than in past works of hers, such as Cosmosis, which is pictured below as well. First, flowers are used as props in Sharon with Peonies, instead of being the main event. Also, Madahar does not try to make the flowers or anything else about her scene look natural. Sharon clearly stands against a set that resembles the sets used in classical mid-20th century Hollywood glamour shots. This feeling of glamour harkens back, but also feels contemporary because of the over-the-top ads, marketing, and fashion photography of today. This contrived setting, contrasted with the untouched and unedited women, reminds us that we're looking at natural female bodies. It's no coincidence that just as the fabricated silver background creases and crumbles, so does the skin and faces of the older women in the series. Madahar places the idealized glamour of the set against our inconvenient and inevitable shared biological realities. Madahar's work can thus be read as a commentary on the fashion industry and our unrealistic expectations for women and how they should look. Overall, Madahar redefines how we think about representations of goddesses in this work. She forces us to reconsider our assumptions about beauty more generally, and she disrupts the traditional relationship between the photographer and the muse. Next up, Sunny will be discussing another theme of the exhibition, Beyond the Figure.
Thank you, Emma, so much for that brilliant presentation. I will be talking about the last but not least part of our exhibition called Beyond the Figure. But first off, I'll introduce myself. Hi, y'all. My name is Sunny Liu, and I'm a rising senior at Yale College, double majoring in history and art, but not art history, ironically. I'm a student guide here at the center, as well as one of the curators of this exhibit. And so within this part of our show, we have 3 works featured on the theme of Beyond the Figure. From left to the right, we have Measure of the Day by Sheila Gerling, Red Circle by Sandra Blow, and Syncopation by Kim Lowe. Before I dive into talk about more about each piece, I will talk about first how we came to decide upon this theme and why we believe it's important. So women in art history, as people have mentioned here, have mostly been made visible through depictions of the female body rather than depictions or recognition of female artists, even in modern art movements from the 20th century like abstraction. We decided on this theme to rewrite that art history to celebrate British female artists who have contributed to the movement of abstraction. And before I go on to then talk about the history of abstraction, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what abstraction even means. So I'm sure that a lot of y'all have been to modern art museums or the modern wings of art museums where you'll see all these art where a lot of people will comment on, oh, I could have made that, or my 5-year-old could have made that. And a lot of those pieces are part of the movement of abstraction, and they're, I believe, some of the most difficult pieces to kind of understand in the art world if you're not already familiar with art history and the art world in general. Abstraction refers to art movement where artists were using colors, forms, gestures, and shapes to create an image. They were not interested in portraying reality, but rather portraying larger concepts, things that they wanted to explore. Sometimes just they wanted to explore color, and so they would dive into that color and what that color could mean. And so it's probably one of the more inaccessible forms of art, but hopefully through this talk, I can give a little bit more explanation to make this art a little more accessible. So in Britain specifically, the abstraction movement arose from the destruction of World War II, which drove the British to rebuild everything, including the art scene. As British artists rediscovered experimental art in the 1950s after World War II, they became especially entranced with the movement across the pond in America, the abstract expressionism movement that really centered around New York City. Art critic Joan Marder argues, art history essentially renders this movement and abstraction in general as a boys' club by focusing on its male artists and their expansive paintings that reek of machismo. And so among what Marder calls this boys' club of abstract expressionism centered around New York, some of the most famous members are artists you might have heard of, like Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, and Robert Rauschenberg. But on the other hand, there were many important women who helped develop abstract art, but they've unfortunately been largely erased from the canon. And so in our exhibit, we hope to rewrite British female artists who contributed to abstraction back into art history. And so I guess that goes on to the question of why did these women abstract artists get left out of history? So there are a couple reasons. For one could argue that it's not just abstraction that's a boys' club, but really the entire art world that is a boys' club. The art world has been historically dominated by male curators, critics, historians, and artists, and the art world unfortunately continues to be predominantly cisgendered white male today. As a result, institutional and academic bias against women pervade art history and the art world in general. Another reason is that the art world often held a sexist misconception, especially with most of its early influential members being male, that female artists were irrelevant or derivative, especially to modern genres like abstraction, which call for deep thinking and critical questioning, which some people sexually believe that women could not adequately do in the same way that men could. Finally, female artists have been overlooked in the abstract art canon because they frequently only get discussed in relation to their husbands. And sadly, that has happened to every single artist featured in this part of the exhibition. So on the right, we have Sheila Gerling's work, and Sheila Gerling has been recognized for her influence on her work of her husband, but not really as much her own work. Her husband is also an abstract artist, but is a sculptor, but she should be really acknowledged as an important abstract artist in her own right. And she creates these beautiful post-cubist, colorful paintings like this one you see called Measure of the Day, that kind of take influence from collage style art and make that sort of art that could often be seen as maybe lesser than some fine art forms and elevates it. Likewise, in the middle, we have Sandra Blow, and her husband, Alberto Burri, created work too. And so they were both artists, and they created work often in response to each other. But only her husband, Burri, rose to international recognition, exemplifying this bias for male artists in the art world. On the other hand, Sandra Blow struggled to establish herself not only as a female artist, but also as an abstractionist, with pieces like we can see here called The Red Circle, because everyone would just think of her as Burri's wife. And she really wanted to make a name for herself and distance herself from just being another abstract artist's wife. And so she even moved physically away from her husband Burri to try to pursue art free from his influence and people assuming that she only made artwork in response to him or to help him in some way. Finally, on the left, we have Kim Lim, and her art was also, unfortunately, sometimes in the shadow of her husband. She was married to fellow abstract artist William Turnbull, and she met him at art school. They were classmates in a ceramics class, which is kind of a cute origin story. And their son is in charge of their estate. And in an interview, he said people tended to assume that Kim Lim was influenced by her husband, William Turnbull, but I'm pretty sure it worked both ways. Having spent many years cataloging both their work, I can see that they both heavily drew influence from each other. And unfortunately, the art world often only assumed that Kim Lim drew inspiration from Turnbull, but not the other way around. We have her print syncopation in our exhibit on the left here. And so speaking of Kim Lim, she's an artist that will dive a little bit more into her work and life today. Next slide, please. So Lim was born in Singapore in 1936, and growing up, she lived in Singapore as well as Penang and Malacca, which are both now part of Malaysia, but at that time, they were all still British colonies. And she then moved to London to go to art school and called London home for the rest of her life, as you can see from the photo in the middle, showing her working in her own London studio. But she was an avid traveler throughout her life. You can see a picture of her and her husband visiting Angkor Wat in Cambodia on the right. And through her travel, she was often inspired by the ancient art of the places she visited. For example, she said in an interview that she was inspired by the flow and rhythm of Indian and Southeast Asian sculptures from many centuries ago. In Greece, she was really entranced by the minimalistic cycladic sculptures. And in China, she was moved most by the formal and decorative simplicity of early Shang Dynasty bronze sculptures. You can really see the influence of all these ancient art forms from around the world in her piece featured in our exhibition, Syncopation, shown on the left. And you can see that in her being inspired by some of these more simplistic, minimalistic, clean-lined forms from the art world for many centuries ago around the world when she was visiting places like Greece and China and Southeast Asia. So in Syncopation, on the left again, it's a piece that a lot of historians have classified as part of the minimalist art movement. Minimalism is a form of abstract art, and it is really known by its simple, clean-lined forms and shapes. And again, like abstract expressionism and perhaps art in general, you could argue, minimalism has been rendered as a boys' club, where art history and the art canon really focus on big male minimalist personalities like Donald Judd, Frank Stella, and Sol LeWitt. One art curator even argued that Lim did not get the recognition she deserved during her lifetime because she specifically made not just sculpture, but minimalist sculpture. And sculpture as an art medium was even considered already macho, and especially minimalist sculpture. Think like Donald Judd's famous giant cubes in West Texas. And in fact, art critics have often described minimalism to have a boorish, masculine aesthetic. But in Kim Lim's piece, Syncopation, featured in our exhibition, Lim is able to inject a fluidity and softness, which she said that she was trying to capture what she called the rhythms of life and the changing qualities of light. Her print Syncopation actually reflects a sculpture she made in 1995 also called syncopation. And Lim made this sculpture out of slate, and she took this big blob of slate and slashed it with regular cuts so that it almost looked like a drawing rather than a solid form. In a similar way, her print syncopation follows the pattern of her slate sculpture. You can see that it is a rectangular blue block slashed with regular cuts at a diagonal to make it look less harsh and less heavy, but rather more organic and light. And the repetitive nature of all these slashes and syncopation almost give it a meditative quality. And because of this, as well as some things that Lim have said throughout her interviews, where Lim would keep denying that she even considers herself part of minimalist movement, some art historians are still debating it today. Some have argued that Lim's sculptures and prints do have the clean lines and simplicity of a lot of minimalist artists from around the same era, but they think that Lim's point of reference is not this Western modern art movement, but rather the Chinese philosophical concept that derives from Taoism and Confucianism called Wu Wei. Wu Wei can be thought of as, I guess in modern terms, going with the flow, but it really means doing things effortlessly because your actions align with the natural course of the universe. And you can take your own side of the debate today. I think that it is a quite interesting thing to consider that we can't just always assume that and put all these people's artworks in these neat little Western art canon boxes. And I think that's what I appreciate about all of these art historians who want to not necessarily assume that Lim wants to be part of this minimalist art movement. And just to finish off, just a little bit more about Lim as an artist and the struggle she faced. Because she was a Singaporean British woman working in the UK during the 20th century, when British society was even more afflicted by systemic racism, sexism, and other forms of marginalization than today, Lim struggled to get the recognition she deserved. For example, in 1977, she was the only woman and the only non-white artist to be exhibited at the first Hayward Annual, which is a yearly exhibition whose goal was to, in their own words, present a cumulative picture of British art as it develops. Today, however, we're celebrating Kim Lim for her mastery of printmaking and contributions to abstract art. And we're rewriting Kim Lim, along with all the other incredible British women artists in our exhibition, back into art history. Now, to finish off, I'll hand it off to Annie.
And so before we conclude, we wanted to direct your attention to Julie Roberts's 1994 painting Gynecology Chair. Through her massive navy canvas, which dwarfs both the empty gynecology chair in the center, as well as the viewer, Roberts illustrates the loneliness and fear faced by women seeking medical assistance due to the fact that their bodies and healthcare continue to be politicized. While not contained within the bays of Women from the Center, Gynecology Chair illustrates the way in which the themes that we established in the exhibit continue throughout the center. We hope that as you walk through the center, which isn't currently open, but hopefully in a few months will be, and beyond, you pay a little bit more attention to the women artists, as well as the contributions of women more broadly in your daily lives. Once again, I want to thank you all for coming and thank the center for the support you provided throughout the development of this exhibition. And I think we now have time for a few questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. What wonderful presentations. And thank you for this wonderful introduction using images from the British Art Center to its permanent collection. Now we'd like to open it up to our audience, and we'll have some time for some Q&As, and we have some already. How did you go about making these particular artistic selections from the entire museum collection?
Yeah, so Annie kind of touched on this already, but I think there were three things that were really important to us when we were picking out the pieces. The first, like we've all talked about, was that they were of women and by women. So unfortunately, that already cut down the selection by a lot, but that also did make it a bit easier for us to kind of sift through those. The other thing that was important to us was that we weren't picking works just because they were of women and by women. So we wanted to make sure that there was another reason in which we were picking them so that we weren't just grouping them based on that. but we also didn't want to force them into themes as well. So we kind of picked pieces that spoke to us and that worked well together, and then also let kind of our themes respond to those works and evolve as we went along. And so this required kind of making some changes as we went. At one point, we had a kind of overall theme of fragmentation and separation, and we ended up moving away from that. Or at one point, we had a theme which was gaze, and we kind of changed that slightly. So like I said, kind of just responding to the works and letting them guide us.
Thank you. Someone asked to clarify the title of the show. Annie.
Yeah, so I mentioned this a little bit, but Women from the Center most obviously points to the fact that, as Linda mentioned, all of the works are from the center's permanent collection. And so we wanted to signal that through the title. However, it also points to the fact that, or to Lucy Lepard's, who was a British writer, her collection of feminist essays, and she was an art critic who incorporated the kind of theory and ideas of second wave feminism into her criticism and was one of the first women to do that. And so we wanted to acknowledge her essay and its impact on our own thinking, as well as art history more broadly. And so that's where the title came from, kind of pointing to these two, I think, equally as important facts of the exhibit, both the center and also the import and influence of feminism on our thinking.
Another question. What part of the putting together of the exhibition did you find the most surprising? Christina.
Once we had decided on the pieces and we're actually trying to put them together on walls, I didn't think that would be as difficult as it was. And the fact that a lot of our, at least 3 of our Friday sessions were just like rearranging things. And it wasn't only like about theme, it was also about aesthetic. So I didn't realize so much went into figuring out how pieces hang on the wall.
I remember that well. Are any of you practicing artists yourselves? Sunny.
I'm an art major, and so by definition, part of my Yale career is making art. And I don't know if I can call myself an artist, but I'm definitely an art student who aspires to be an artist.
Thank you. Here's a question from a good friend. To what extent did you find yourselves investigating how socioeconomic class impacted the lives of some of these women artists? The extent to which class acted as another exclusionary force alongside gender discrimination. Emma?
Yeah, I think this definitely applied in my works. I know, just as one example, that Julia Margaret Cameron was a photographer, and she was only able to do this because of her wealth. And she had kind of genuine intentions in trying to kind of raise up her models, who were often people who were of lower economic status, but oftentimes it ended up being kind of exploitative. So in Irish Mary, which you saw, she kind of just found someone from the street and cast them as the Virgin Mary, which was supposed to be a way to lift them up, but she kind of doesn't name them and didn't ask how they wanted to be shown. I think I was also thinking about this with the Fanny Eaton piece, because the reason that Fanny Eaton actually became a muse was to try to support her 10 children. And so she kind of had no choice but to become a muse for the pre-Raphaelites. So I think that often when it came to women being photographed and women choosing to photograph, you can't really kind of ignore people's socioeconomic statuses. It's really kind of present in the works.
Thank you. Hi all, love the presentation. How did you think about intersectionality and feminism, especially issues of race and class, when curating these works? Annie.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say too, I think that's why having like such a, as you heard, we all have such different majors and different like research focuses. And so that's where I think the strength of the exhibit really comes from, is that we were able to focus on intersectionality because we all come from such different majors and backgrounds. But I will say, specifically in thinking about, for example, the Carrie Weems piece, she is a Black artist who focuses a lot on race. I think that it was kind of intrinsic within the work. Like the works asked us to talk and think about intersectionality, and as Emma mentioned, the way that class or race played into their identity and their relationship specifically to art and Britishness. And those were kind of things that we wanted to address and the works wanted us to address, if that makes sense. And so I think that it's very much baked into the works and baked into the exhibit for that reason, and was definitely on the forefront of all of our minds. and something that I think worked well with conversations that are already happening at the center within works from every time period. So when the center opens, I think you'll see that on the 4th floor, on the 2nd floor, on our exhibit, really everywhere. It's there.
Thank you. To what extent did you examine your own biases and reactions to your analysis? Christina.
That was definitely a process. I know some of the works, like Emma mentioned, the Irish Mary, were a tad bit problematic. And it really just got down to whether we wanted to show them and whether we wanted to put them in conversation with other works. And at least what I took away from the process was that it was essential to have and to start those conversations instead of like hiding the works or not exhibiting them. And my own bias would have been just to like hide them, not give them any more airtime. But I think the conversations that we are starting through this exhibition are really important.
Thank you. One last question. How do we approach the male gaze question when there are women who desire women? And how does this differ in the work of queer women? Emma.
Well, this doesn't exactly answer that question, but I think that one thing that came up for me, especially because I was focusing on women as muses, was that just because there is a woman behind the camera, it doesn't mean that it'll eliminate any sense of the male gaze or a gaze that is kind of infringing on someone more generally. And so we saw that kind of when comparing the Madame Yvonne to Sharon with Peonies, in that even though it was a woman behind the camera, she still had some kind of problematic intentions we were talking about, or the same with the Fanny Eaton, in which they were really trying to make her look exotic and were trying to kind of just comment on her mixed race status. So I do think that one important takeaway was just to be wary of the idea that just because there is a woman or someone who identifies as a woman behind the camera or who's holding the brush doesn't mean that we can still kind of like ignore whether the muse is being exploited or the woman is being put there just for us to kind of appreciate her beauty and to look at.
Thank you. I'm going to make an exception for this one last question because this viewer was in the very first student guide class that there was. And her question is, how did feminist art history, i.e. Linda Nochlin, impact your curatorial process? At what point in the curatorial process did you find this art history having the greatest impact? And perhaps you might want to identify who Linda Nochlin is. Annie.
And so I guess just for a little bit of background for those who don't know about Linda Nochlin, she was much like Lucy Lepard, a feminist art critic, and I believe an art history professor as well. And kind of her, I mean, she made so many contributions, but I think her most famous is the essay entitled "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?", where she argued that basically it was due to lack of access, not due to lack of skill. And I think that that's something that like was definitely at the forefront of our minds when we were thinking about this exhibit, in the sense of where are the women artists in the museums that we love, where are the depictions of women that I think represent us or represent our experiences or the women we know. And so, I mean, I think that that was very much on the forefront of the way we thought about who we wanted to include in the exhibit, not to say that we wanted to only represent empowered women or, like kind of the feminist ideal of womanhood. As Christina mentioned, we definitely leaned into discomfort or gray areas where that wasn't always the case. But I definitely think that Nochlin, her essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?", and the contribution of feminist art historians was definitely very much a part of our exhibit, and leaning into where there might have been gaps or gray areas in that legacy of feminist art history as well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Sunny and Christina, Annie, Emma, and Olivia. What a terrific job you did. And thank you to our viewers. We had it up on the screen, but this will be up on our website, as will a installation video of the exhibition, because it actually is currently installed in our galleries, but obviously because of COVID, you can't see it there. However, with a proper Yale ID, the museum is going to be open next weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Please check the website for the hours. And with, again, proper ID, you will have an opportunity to come and visit and actually see the installation of the exhibit. So thank you all visitors, and thank you all participants. You did a wonderful job.